What's happening, everybody? Welcome to today's edition of SWAC Talk, the show where we cover the SWAC inside and out. Of course, I am your tour guide, driving that tour bus all around the SWAC, man, from Florida to Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, and all parts in between. We are coming to the finish line of the 2021 football season. Only one game left on the slate, and that's Saturday, 11 o'clock kickoff. ABC Celebration Bowl, Jackson State Tigers, South Carolina State Bulldogs. We'll break that game down on Wednesday, and then we'll cover the recap of that game on Sunday. Thursday, obviously, Swag Smoke live as usual, 6 p.m. Central Time, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So that's the schedule for now. Prairie View still has the coaching search out, so whenever that news drops, you'll get a video for that. And that leads to checking out the socials on the bottom of the screen as usual, man. Hit them up and do what you got to do with that. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Hit that notification bell so when I drop that Prairie View coaching news, you'll get it when the video drops. You don't have to wait and see. You'll get that notification. So make sure you do that, man, because we're going to be dropping some things from time to time, and don't miss out on any of that. So what I wanted to do today was just kind of recap the season. Gonna look at some of the stats overall, who led the league and what. Gonna cover my predictions that I made in my individual team previews, and if you missed those, I'm gonna put in the description of this video. I'm gonna have a playlist that has all 12 predictions plus my predicted order of finish video. I'll be on now, so you can check all that out if you haven't watched it. If you want to watch it again and laugh at me for being wrong, then, man, go for yours. I'm here for it. So, with that being said, man, let's go ahead and hop on into this. So, I think I'm going to go ahead and start with my predictions. I'm going to run through every team I picked. I picked their record. Now, on my videos, I did a floor and a ceiling. I'm not going to cover that because, to me, that doesn't really matter right now. I'm just going to recap how I picked these teams, and then I'm gonna recap how I picked the predicted order of finish, and I'm gonna also state how these teams actually finished in the order of finish and with their records overall. So to start it off, I picked Alabama A&M. I was very high on the Bulldogs coming into this season. I felt like coming off of a spring championship that they were the team to beat. Now I figured that Jackson State, Florida A&M portion of their schedule will be the toughest games on their schedule, and I was right about that. But I did not predict Grambling being a factor in taking and giving them a loss. So I predicted the Bulldogs to finish 9-1. They actually ended up finishing 7-3 on the season. That Grambling Jackson FAMU stretch wore them out, and they were able to right the ship at the end. But that's what basically took them out of contention for the division. Alabama State, I predicted to finish 6-5. They finished 5-6. They fired Coach Ely after losing the Magic City Classic, and they won a couple games to end the season. They actually finished the season on a 2-game winning streak. Had an opportunity to beat Prairie View as well in that game, in that portion of the season, but they lost that game. So, one game off ain't that big of a difference. 5-6, 6-5 ain't that big of a difference. But Alabama State came out on the bottom end of that prediction. Alcorn, I predicted to finish 8-3. They finished 6-5. They took losses. They took a loss to Southern, which I did not predict, and they took a loss to North Carolina Central in the MEAC SWAC Challenge, which is a game that I did not predict them to lose. So those were a couple games that I thought that they would win that they didn't. Alcorn still finished second in the division, but I had them slated to win the division and being a factor in winning the SWAC as a whole. So they finished 6-5. I picked them 8-3. Next up was Bethune-Cookman. I had them finishing at 6-5, and this was probably one of my biggest misses on the season. They finished 2-9, and they actually were 0-8 to start the season, and won 2 games in a row before they lost the Florida Classic to FAMU. So that was a team who had a season that was not, was very just horrendous. They did not play well. They were in a lot of games, but they could not win games. and they finally found themselves being able to beat UAPB and Grambling to basically pick up their only 2 wins of the season. They were in a couple games that they had a chance to win late and could not get it done, but they ultimately finished 2-9 instead of what I predicted at 6-5. Florida and them, I picked at 8-3. They ended up finishing 9-3. So not a bad prediction. I thought, what, breaking in, um, having to figure out who their starting quarterback was going to be the issue for this team. And for, the early portion of the season, that's what kind of slowed them down. They lost to Jackson State to start the season, and they lost to USF to start the season. And then they won like 8 games in a row before ultimately losing in the playoffs. So this team had a very successful season, and I thought that they could do that if they could get some things going. And they found some running game to get them over the hump, and their defense was tremendous all year outside of their last game. So again, not a bad prediction by me, but I thought that they could be a factor in the division. Jackson State, I picked to finish 9-2. I felt like the ULM game would probably be one of the games they lose. And I did pick them to lose to Alabama A&M, which I was very, very wrong about. That game really was the game that really showed the potential of this team. They did not offensively play to that level much of the season, but they had a very explosive offense in terms of passing offense. They did not score a crazy amount of points most of the season, but their defense was just godly. You could not move the ball, you could not score the ball on them, and they controlled everybody that they played, and ultimately finished 11-1 and won the SWAC championship. So I thought that they could have that potential, but I kind of hedged my bets a little bit, and I picked them to finish 9-2, finish 11-1 with a Celebration Bowl berth upcoming. Grambling, excuse me, I skipped over Grambling. Grambling, I picked to finish 3-8. They finished 4-7. So not a big difference. I thought this team had the potential to play better if the defense played better, and the defense was much improved over the spring. The offense was not good. They say their best offensive performance for the last game of the season, and kind of gave a glimpse of what probably could have been if they could have had some offensive consistency. But Grambling, they picked up a big victory over Alabama A&M, and they beat Southern in the Bayou Classic. So those were 2 games that kind of turned the tide for them. Valley, I picked to finish 2-9. Although I did say Valley had an opportunity to be a bit dangerous, but I could not really find those wins when I was doing my own paper prediction. But they picked up a 4-7 record to finish the season, and they got a victory over Prairie View to close out the season that really gave them that boost and a 4-7 record on the season. And they finished on a 2-game winning streak, which they had two-game winning streaks over the course of the season. So that's something that Valley can definitely put a feather in their cap for this season. And ultimately, for some teams, 4-7 is not a good record at all. 4-7 for some teams is a horrible failure of a season. But for Valley, that 4-7 mark was their best mark since like 2010 or 2011. So that was a much improved record for Valley, and now they are a factor at least to be in that mid pack of the division, and they're recruiting well, so they're going to be a team to keep an eye out on in the future. Prairie View, I had finishing 5-6. They finished 7-5 and won the West Division. They picked up a couple of nice victories. They had a close loss to Alcorn that kind of, maybe had changed some of the trajectory of the perception of that season. But a 7-5 record with a championship game berth, their first championship game berth since 2009. So a very successful season for the Panthers. And I thought that they offensively, I was the biggest question mark that I had. And I thought the offense really came around in certain games to help them get over that hump. Southern, I had finishing 8-3. They finished 4-7. The season just did not go the way that anybody really expected it to. Just not a lot of consistency on the season. Second half issues caused them like 3 games. Just not really being well with tackling on defense. Offensively, they did what Southern does. They ran the ball well most of the season. The passing game was up and down, but they were in a lot of games. They really took a couple horrible losses. They lost to Texas Southern, which was probably the game that kind of set the season kind of in a spin. Prairie View bombed them on homecoming. And they were in the game against FAMU and Jackson State. They lost both of those games, mainly the second half. And, the Grambling game was what it was. So Southern finishing 4-7, which was like 4 games off of my prediction. They finished the season on a 3-game losing streak. It's just not the kind of season that anybody really expected coming into the season, and it just did not turn out well. Texas Southern, I had at 1-10. Although I did say I thought that they would get a couple conference wins at some point, at least one. They ultimately finished with a 2-8 record. That does not account for that game that they played against North American. So they really have won. They really won 3 games. They were able to beat Southern, which was a game that they just really kind of stepped out there and took over. They played very well in that game. And Andrew Body kind of came out of nowhere. If you were not a Texas Southern fan, you did not really know of him before that stretch of games that he played, and kind of put the team on the map to be a dangerous team moving forward in the future. And finally, Pine Bluff, I had them finishing 4-7. I felt like this team, even though they won the division in the spring, that they would kind of falter. Although I felt like they would be a better team than what the record showed, because I thought their schedule was kind of tough. Even though they had a lot of good teams at home, I still felt that they had a tough home slate that would be tough for them to break through. Because number one, Pine Bluff has a history of not following up a division conference championship with a successful season the next year. So I went with the history factor, and it kind of rang true. And they finished 2-9 on the season, and just were not. They were just not good all year. They just never really found their stride. They were just lost and lackluster all year. And so they finished 2-9, like I said, compared to my 4-7 record. And they just did not look good at all. Honestly, other than maybe the first half of the Alcorn game, they didn't look good most of the season. So not a good season for Pine Bluff coming off of that West Division in the spring. And that kind of led to some things where you look at, how the spring turned out and how the fall turned out. It was almost an inverse for a lot of teams. And it kind of brought into question, how worth it was the spring season for some teams, or was it more worth it for others? But ultimately, the 2 teams who made the championship in the spring finished third or lower in their divisions in the fall. So, new champs, new division champs, new conference champ. And now we have opportunity for a team that can actually win the Celebration Bowl. So that's a very positive thing. Looking at my predicted order of finish, in the East, I had Alabama A&M finishing first. They finished third. I had FAMU finishing second. They finished second. I had Jackson State finishing third, primarily because I was in that show me mode. I knew this team could do what they did, but I didn't want to predict them to do it. I wanted to see them do it and then, go that route. Obviously that's a hedge bet, and that's not really going out on a limb. And so I kind of played it safe, and I picked them third. They finished first. Bethune-Cookman I had finishing fourth. They actually ended up finishing last in the division. Alabama State I had finishing fifth. They finished fourth. And Valley I had finishing last. They finished fifth. So I had the top 3 teams I had the top. Well, basically I had the whole East Division, top half and bottom half picked correctly. But the order of those teams was where the difference came at. Like I said, the biggest miss I had was Bethune-Cookman, because I had them as a team who could, if they could steal a game or two, could finish in that top 3, and they actually finished last. So that was probably my biggest miss on the season, in terms of just not totally miscalculating how many games they would win and what kind of impact they would have on the season. In the West, I had Alcorn finishing first. They finished second. I had Southern finishing second. They finished fourth. They finished tied with Grambling, and Grambling beat them head to head. So Southern finished fourth in the West Division. I had them pick second. Pine Bluff finished third. I had them finish. I picked Pine Bluff third. They finished sixth. That was another big miss that I had. Prairie View had finishing fourth. They won the West Division, so that was a big jump from where I predicted to where they finished in a positive manner. Grambling had finishing fifth. They finished third. Like I said, they finished tied with Southern, but they beat Southern. So, obviously head to head takes precedence in that situation. And Texas Southern, I had finishing sixth. They finished fifth at 2-6 in conference. So again, Pine Bluff was probably my biggest drop off. Although Southern going from predicted second to fourth is a bad drop off. Prairie View had the biggest jump from fourth to first. Alcorn dropped from first to second, and basically Grambling moved from fifth to third. So this division I was all over the place. The only team that I had in the top half that finished in the top half was Alcorn, and the bottom half was a state of flux too. So the West was all over the place in my predictions. The East was a little bit more in tune to what I picked, but the order was just different. So all in all, not that bad of a prediction for me. My misses were very huge misses. So I was kind of off. When I was off, I was off. When I was on, I was a little bit more closer to where I wanted to be. So not a bad season for me. Obviously an entertaining season, and we had some things that really had, some really good games, some really games that should have been good that did not turn out good. And now we're gonna just kind of do a little look back at the season. We'll look at some of the overall statistics. Alabama A&M led the league in scoring offense at 37.9 points per game. Jackson State was second at 29. Texas Southern was third, was tied for second with Jackson State at 29 points per game. That was a big surprise for a lot of people. Florida A&M was fourth at 27.8 points per game, and Southern was fifth at 26.4 points per game. Jackson State led the league in scoring defense at 13 and a half points per game. That defense, like I said, they only allowed 17 touchdowns on the season, which was 10 less than the second place team. That defense just did not allow many points at all. Florida A&M was second with 17 points per game. Alcorn was third with 25.8 points per game. Prairie View was fourth with 26.3, and Grambling was fifth with 27.6. So Grambling's defense improved a bit. The offense was not there, but the defense really did a good job this season. They were an underrated defense all year, and they had some really special plays on the season. The Bulldogs, Alabama A&M, led the league in total offense at 477 yards per game. They had 50 total touchdowns, which was 12 more than the second place team of Texas Southern, who finished second in the league in total offense with 429 yards per game. That offense was very explosive this year. Like I keep saying, they caught a lot of people by surprise. Texas Southern fans, they kind of knew it, and they kind of tried to tell us, but we didn't listen. We found out the hard way. Prairie View was third offensively with 388 yards per game. Alcorn was fourth with 384 yards per game, and FAMU was fifth with 380 yards per game. Jackson State led the league in total defense with 255.9 yards per game. Florida A&M was second with 277.9 yards per game. Prairie View was third with 314 yards per game. Alabama State was fourth with 348.7 yards per game, and Alcorn was fifth at 368.6 yards per game. Rushing offense, Southern would ultimately still lead the league in rushing at 197.8 yards per game. They had 22 touchdowns on the season. Second to Texas Southern with 23 rushing touchdowns on the season and 5.1 yards per rush, which actually led the league in that category. This team was very good offensively. I keep saying it over and over. They averaged 188.1 yards per game on the ground. Prairie View was third with 161.3 yards per game. Florida A&M was fourth at 159.2. Alcorn was fifth at 158.4. The top defense in rushing was Florida A&M at 94.3 yards per game. Jackson State 99.5. Jackson State only allowed 7 rushing touchdowns on the season. Florida A&M 13. Jackson State allowed an average of 2.8 yards per rush. Florida A&M 3 yards per rush. 136 yards per game for Alcorn, which was third. For Prairie View, 138 yards per game, which was fourth. And Valley was fifth in the league in rushing defense at 144 yards per game. And they only allowed 14 touchdowns on the ground. So they had the third least rushing touchdowns allowed on the season. Really good season for Valley on that front, on the defensive side. Passing offense, Alabama A&M was first, 366 yards per game, 37 touchdowns, which was 8 more than anybody else. They only threw 9 interceptions on the season, although the bulk of those came in that 3-game stretch that kind of wrecked their season. Jackson State was second with 6 interceptions on the season and 29 touchdowns, 254 yards per game. The fewest interceptions thrown by a team was Texas Southern. They only threw 4 on the season. They had 15 touchdowns and 241 yards per game. Prairie View was fourth with 227 yards per game passing. And Alcorn was fifth at 226 with 5 interceptions and 20 touchdowns. Jackson State led the league in passing defense with 156.4 yards per game allowed. They had 12 interceptions on the season, which was second in the league, and they allowed 10 touchdowns, which was the fewest. Florida A&M was second. Prairie View was second with 175 yards per game through the air. They had 10 interceptions, allowed 19 touchdowns. Florida A&M had 13 interceptions, along with Valley, who had 13 interceptions, which led the league. Florida A&M allowed 12 touchdowns on the season and 183.6 yards per game. Alabama State was fourth with 196 yards per game allowed passing, and Groundling was fifth at 198 yards per game passing, and they had 10 interceptions on the season. Defensively, Florida A&M led the league with the fewest sacks. They allowed 15 on the season. Southern was second, allowing 17. Texas Southern only allowed 18 sacks. Prairie View 21 and Grambling 23. Jackson State led the league with 52 sacks. That's 10 more than Florida A&M, who finished second with 42. They had 15 more sacks than the third place team in Grambling and Prairie View. They both had 27, and Alabama State had 26. Southern led the league in third down conversions, which was with 41%. Alabama A&M second, 40%. Jackson State third, 39%. Alcorn, 39%. And Prairie View, 38%. Jackson State allowed the lowest percentage of third down conversions at 27.4%. Prairie View was second at 31%. Florida A&M, 35%. Alabama State, 33%. And Alabama A&M, even though we talked about how bad that defense was, they only allowed a 37% completion rate on third downs on the season. Prairie View was the least penalized team in terms of yards per game with 44.9, Grambling 48.7, 52.5 for Alcorn, Valley 52.9, and Pine Bluff 56.2. The team with the fewest penalties in the league for them was Grambling with 51. Prairie View was second with 59, Texas Southern 64, Pine Bluff 66, and Valley 69. Opponents, Alabama A&M, their opponents averaged 93 yards per game in penalties. Pine Bluff opponents 80 yards in penalties. Grambling 77, Alcorn 74, and Bethune-Cookman 65. Grambling's opponents were penalized 94 times. Alabama A&M 92, Pine Bluff 88, Alcorn 86, and Bethune-Cookman 77. Alabama A&M led the league in red zone scoring. They scored on 85% of their trips in the red zone. Southern 87%, which led the league in terms of percentage. Bethune-Cookman 85.3%, Grambling 84.4%, and Texas Southern 83.7%. Alabama A&M was 42 of 49 in the red zone, and they had 37 touchdowns in the red zone. They led the league. Texas Southern had 30 red zone touchdowns, and they were 36 of 43. Florida A&M was 35 of 47. They had 23 touchdowns. Alcorn 33 of 45. They had 26 touchdowns. Prairie View 32 of 42, and they had 19 touchdowns. Southern actually, Southern's opponents were 46 of 57 in the red zone, and they had 33 touchdowns. They converted 80% in the red zone. Texas Southern 42 of 55 for 76% and 35 touchdowns for the opponent. Bethune-Cookman 43 of 48, 89%, 35 touchdowns in the red zone. Pine Bluff 41 of 47 for the opponents, 87%, 32 touchdowns. And Valley 34 of 42, 81%, 27 touchdowns. Jackson State had the best in terms of not allowing the opponents to have any success in the red zone. Their opponents only scored 8 touchdowns in the red zone, although they were 18 of 22 on the season for 81%. They did allow 10 out of 10 on field goals. The opponents kicked 10 field goals and made all of them in the red zone. Looking at some individual leaders, Garrett Quarles would lead the league in rushing with 95.5 yards per game. There were no individual 1,000-yard rushers on the season. Caleb Johnson and Bishop Barnett both finished with 993 yards. That led the league in terms of yardage. Quarles, like I said, led in yards per game with 95.5, 90 yards for Caleb Johnson. Bishop Barnett, 82 yards per game. Kobe Dillon from Southern, 78 yards per game. And Nico Duffy, 75 yards per game. Garrett Quarles also led the league in rushing touchdowns with 10. Johnson, 8. Jaden Stewart from Prairie View with 7. Kier Crossley with 7. And Ja'Cory Howard with 7. Crossley from Pine Bluff and Ja'Cory Howard from Texas Southern with 7. Akil Glass was the leading passer on the season. He threw for 356 yards per game. Shadur Sanders, 254. Felix Harper, 226. Jawan Pass from Prairie View, 219. Rashawn McKay, 204 from Florida A&M. Glass, 36 touchdowns to lead the league. 29 for Shadur Sanders. 22 for McKay, which was third. Felix Harper was second with 20. And Jawan Pass with 16. Jawan Pass threw the most interceptions on the season with 12. Shannon Patrick with 10 from Pine Bluff. Skylar Perry with 9 from UAPB. Glass and Ryan Nettles both had 7, along with Jelani Eason from Valley, Nettles from Alabama State. Receiving, Abdul Fatai Ibrahim from Alabama A&M led the league with 100 yards per game receiving. He also was the only receiver to go over 1,000 yards on the season with 1,008. He had 67 receptions. Running down the yards per game mark, Adu Hilaire, 91 yards per game. Keelan Davis from Texas Southern, 89 yards per game. Kamari Averett from Bethune-Cookman, 80 yards per game. And Keith Corbin from Jackson State, 74 yards per game. Looking at total yardage receiving, Ibrahim, 1,008. Hilaire, 918. Keith Corbin, 897. Keelan Davis, 893. And Averett, 888. The leading guy in terms of receptions was Adu Hilaire with 71. Ibrahim, 67. Corbin, 65. Xavier Smith from Florida A&M, 64. And Jamare Shareed from Florida A&M, 55. Touchdowns. D. Anderson from Alabama A&M, he had 12 touchdowns on the season. Malachi Wideman from Jackson State, 12 touchdowns. Averett, 10 touchdowns. Hilaire, 9 touchdowns. Shareed, 9 touchdowns. In terms of scoring on touchdowns, you had D. Anderson. He led the league, tied with Wideman. They both had 72 points on the season. Looking at points per game, they both averaged Anderson 8 points per game and Wideman 7.2. Like I said, he had Weidman and Anderson both had 9 touchdowns. Garrett Quarles 10 touchdowns. Hilaire 10 touchdowns. In terms of kicking, Jose Romo Martinez led the league in scoring as a kicker. He had 85 points, 7.1 points per game. Defensively, Ontario Johnson led the league in tackles with 101. Aubrey Miller 100. Marquise Bell from Florida A&M 95. Jawan Taylor from Alcorn 83. Drake Cheatham from Prairie View 86. Trayshawn Smith from Prairie View 84. Tackles for loss. Isaiah Lamb from Florida A&M led the league with 25.5 tackles for loss. James Houston from Jackson State 21.5. Jason Dumas from Prairie View 17.5. Antoine Owens from Jackson State 17 tackles for loss. Keontae Hampton from Jackson State 13 tackles for loss. Brian Powell from Grambling 12 tackles for loss. Land led the league with 19 total sacks. Houston from Jackson State 14.5. Dumas 8.5. Savion Williams from Florida A&M 6.5 sacks. Ronnie Thomas from Valley 6.5 sacks. Aubrey Miller 6.5 sacks from Jackson State. Interceptions. Drake Cheatham led the league from Prairie View. He had 5 interceptions on the season and 1 touchdown. Omari Hill Robinson from Bethune-Cookman and B.J. Bowler from Florida A&M both had 4 interceptions. And then we had a gang of guys with 3 interceptions apiece. Troutman from Alabama A&M, Mitchell from Grambling, Daniels from Valley, Davis from Alabama State, Foster from Southern, Silman Craig from Jackson State, Fuller from Pine Bluff, Shiloh Sanders from Jackson State, and Morgan from Florida A&M. They all had 3 interceptions apiece on the season. Looking at some game highs, Jackson State had the highest point total scored on the season with 61. Texas Southern put 59 on Pine Bluff. Alabama A&M had 52 points against Texas Southern. Alabama A&M also had 52 points against Pine Bluff. Texas Southern had 49 points against Alabama A&M. Prairie View 48 against Southern. Florida A&M 46 against Bethune-Cookman. Alabama A&M 45 against Tuskegee. Alcorn 44 against Texas Southern. Valley 44 against Alabama State. Grambling had the most field goals on the season with 5 against Southern and 3 against Alabama A&M. Alabama State 3 field goals against Tuskegee. Valley 4 against Alcorn. Prairie View had 2 field goals against Southern Alabama A&M, and Florida A&M both had 3 against Bethune-Cookman and South Carolina State. Jackson State scored 9 touchdowns on the season individual as a team against Alabama A&M. Texas Southern had 8 touchdowns against Pine Bluff. Texas Southern had the most yardage in a game this year, and that was against Pine Bluff with 569 yards per game. Jackson State had 247 yards against Alabama A&M and 4 touchdowns. Southern ran for 5 touchdowns against Miles and 3 against against Arkansas Pine Bluff. Just a couple individual numbers. This thing doesn't want to act right. SWAC website is acting crazy, so we're not going to really worry about that part. And we're not going to really spend too much time here. Again, just wanted to kind of run through a couple of things real quick on the season. Like I said, Celebration Bowl coming up on Saturday, December 18th. So we'll preview a game on Wednesday, recap the game on Sunday, and then we'll pretty much be in basketball mode after that. If any major thing happens on Wednesday is also early signing day for football, so we'll probably talk about that a little bit along with our Celebration Bowl preview. After that, anything else comes through, we'll drop a video when it happens. So make sure you stay tuned to SWACtalk. I'm your tour guide, C. Wells, man. I'm about to stop this bus and hop off. Y'all enjoy y'all Sunday, and we will see y'all on Wednesday. We out of here.